I did not cry when I was fired on my wedding day. Staring at the cold message, I realized someone just burned down their own company. 10 minutes after my vows. The executive texted, "You are done. Consider it my gift to you." She thought she took my title, but she eliminated the only person who could disprove their catastrophic fraud. Then her husband called. One time, then 10 times, shaking my reception with his panic. "My name is Quinn Reyes. Just 20 minutes ago, I stood at the altar of a centuries-old stone church in Marlow, Ohio, and promised my life to the man holding my hands. The air smelled of expensive white lilies and melting beeswax candles. Everything was perfect. The stained glass windows cast a warm, golden light across the heavy wooden pews. I was still clutching my bridal bouquet, the stems tightly wrapped in ivory silk, when my maid of honor, Sarah, rushed over and tapped my shoulder. She looked incredibly pale, her eyes darting around the joyful crowd. She handed me my phone. It was vibrating so hard it felt like a trapped hornet against my palm. I swiped the screen. A single text message glowed intensely against the dim light of the church vestibule. It was from Delia Holloway. She was the wife of the chief executive officer at Blackmere Utilities Group, and she also held the ultimate power over senior human resources and operations. The message read, "You are fired. Consider it my gift to you." Before I could even process the sheer cruelty of those words, a banner notification dropped down from my work email. My account was already being wiped from the corporate server. It was a company-wide announcement. The email enthusiastically declared that Piper Shaw would immediately assume all of my responsibilities on the flagship project. Piper Shaw. Delia had practically installed her young niece in my shadow exactly 3 months ago under the guise of bringing a fresh perspective to our team. I stood completely frozen. The cold stone of the church floor seeped through the thin satin soles of my bridal shoes. I was not stunned because I had lost my job. Layoffs happen. Corporate restructuring happens. I was stunned because of the precise, surgical timing of the execution. Today was my wedding day. It was the one day, the exact hour, when I was completely disconnected from the Blackmere internal network. I had happily handed over my administrative keys yesterday afternoon to enjoy my honeymoon. I was entirely offline. Someone had carefully calculated this exact moment to strike. Knowing I would be surrounded by my closest family, wearing a heavy white dress, and utterly unable to log into a computer terminal to fight back, Luca Bennett, my husband of exactly 15 minutes, stepped away from a group of congratulating relatives and placed a warm hand on my bare shoulder. My brand new husband was not a corporate shark. He did not care about profit margins, quarterly earnings reports, or hostile board meetings. Luca was an environmental compliance analyst for the Clean Water Oversight Bureau of the state of Ohio. He spent his days buried in ecological impact reports and water purity regulations. I expected him to read the vicious text message and erupt into defensive anger. I expected him to yell, to demand we call an employment lawyer right that second, to curse Delia Holloway and her entire executive team. He did none of those things. His dark eyes scanned the bright screen of my phone. His jaw tightened instantly. The soft, loving groom who had just cried during our vows vanished, replaced entirely by the sharp, analytical state investigator. His reaction was pure, calculated vigilance. He did not look at the phone like it was a personal insult. He looked at it like it was a piece of forensic evidence at a fresh crime scene. "Quinn," Luca said. His voice was incredibly low, barely carrying over the joyful echoes of our guests heading toward the main reception hall. "Look at me." I met his gaze. The panic in my chest was rapidly forming into a hard, cold knot. "She fired me. Luca. Right now. Right after we said our vows." They gave my entire department to her niece. "Listen to me carefully," he whispered, pulling me gently by the elbow into the deep shadow of a large stone pillar, away from the wandering eyes of the wedding photographer. The distant sounds of a string quartet warming up drifted down the long hallway. "This is not about you, not really. Over the past 7 days, The state audit system has been throwing massive red flags. They are all over your company. I frowned, my veil brushing softly against my cheeks as I shook my head in total confusion. What are you talking about? Which project? The Great Lakes Renewal Corridor. Luca replied without hesitation. My breath caught in my throat. That was my project. It was the absolute crown jewel of Blackmere Utilities Group. It was a massive water treatment modernization package worth over $2.3 billion. I had built the entire internal compliance framework for it from the ground up. It was my life's work for the past 4 years. What kind of red flags? I asked, my voice trembling slightly as the terrifying reality of his words started to sink in. File discrepancies, Luca explained, his eyes constantly scanning the empty vestibule to ensure no one was listening to our conversation. The state system automatically flagged multiple irregular submissions this week. Someone at Blackmere has been quietly pushing technical specification changes into the state portal. But here is the massive problem. Quinn. These changes are showing up with timestamps dated after the lead engineers have already signed off on the original plans. The beautiful bridal bouquet finally slipped from my loose grip, the delicate white lilies bruising against the hard stone floor. My mind violently raced through the complex digital architecture of the security system I had personally designed for Blackmere. That is impossible, I stated firmly, shaking my head again. The software simply does not allow that to happen. Any change to a specification sheet after the final engineering approval requires a complete administrative override. It immediately triggers a loud alert directly to my desk. No one in the entire building can bypass that security protocol. Unless the person sitting at that desk is suddenly gone, Luca pointed out softly. His words hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. The heavy wooden doors to the main reception hall suddenly swung wide open, releasing a bright burst of laughter, clinking champagne glasses, and upbeat jazz music into the quiet corridor. The contrast between the two worlds was absolutely nauseating. In that beautiful room, my closest friends and family members were drinking expensive wine and celebrating what was supposed to be the happiest day of my entire life. Out here in the cold, dim hallway, the protective walls of my career were rapidly collapsing, revealing a massive, terrifying corporate conspiracy hiding right beneath the rubble. I stared at the black screen of my phone. The scattered pieces of the puzzle aggressively slammed together in my mind with terrifying clarity. Delia Holloway did not send that cruel message today because she harbored some petty, personal hatred for me. She did not orchestrate this elaborate public humiliation just to clear a comfortable path for her inexperienced niece to climb the corporate ladder. The truth was far colder and infinitely more dangerous. Delia Holloway fired me today because she desperately needed me to disappear at this exact moment. I was the only person who monitored the compliance system. I was the only person who knew exactly how the digital locks worked and where the data was stored. By terminating me while I was standing at the altar, locked out of the network and distracted by my own wedding, she had bought herself a silent, unmonitored window of time. She was not just handing my job to Piper. She was removing the one person who could see exactly what they were doing before the damage spread. My phone buzzed again. Then it buzzed a second time. Then a third. It was not Delia this time. I looked down and saw the incoming caller identification flashing brightly on the screen. It was Nathan Holloway, the chief executive officer, Delia's husband. He was calling me. I let it ring. He called again and again. By the 10th consecutive call, the relentless vibration of the device seemed to shake the very foundation of my wedding day. They had cut my access, and now they were panicking. I did not shed a single tear. The sadness completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but cold, absolute clarity. They thought they had buried me by taking away my title, but they had merely handed me the shovel. To truly comprehend the catastrophic mistake Delia made today, you have to understand the invisible architecture of Blackmere Utilities Group. I was never a standard operations engineer who wore a hard hat and stared at blueprints in a muddy site trailer. I was the internal compliance system architect. I did not just enforce the rules of the company. I wrote the digital code that made breaking those rules impossible 4 years ago. I designed and deployed a proprietary software platform I named ClearChain. It was an unalterable digital ledger specifically built to track the entire life cycle of every single technical approval within the corporation. Before ClearChain, an unethical project manager could quietly swap out a high-grade industrial pipe for a cheaper alternative with a simple paper memo that could conveniently get lost in a filing cabinet. My system ended that era overnight. If the engineering team needed to change the specifications for the active filtration materials inside the primary water treatment plants, that request had to be processed directly through ClearChain. If a draftsperson submitted new blueprints for the underground concrete storage tank upgrades, the document was stamped, encrypted, and securely locked into the system. The acceptable indices for chemical pipe corrosion, the official safety certifications for every third-party supplier, the exact, mandated schedules for the water quality sensor calibrations. Every single critical data point was mathematically chained together. This extreme level of surveillance was not corporate paranoia. It was an absolute financial necessity. The Great Lakes Renewal Corridor was not a standard suburban construction contract. It was a massive public infrastructure initiative worth over $2.3 billion. A project of that staggering magnitude is intricately tied to complex municipal bonds, astronomical public liability insurance policies, and strict, unforgiving commitments from international infrastructure investment funds. If a localized water supply is contaminated because a contractor used a substandard carbon mesh, the federal government does not just issue a financial fine. They dismantle the entire company and hand out prison sentences. ClearChain was the ultimate shield protecting Blackmere from that exact nightmare scenario. Nathan Holloway, for all his current cowardice, used to understand this perfectly. During the intensely competitive bidding phases for the corridor project, the chief executive officer treated me like his absolute secret weapon. He would confidently march me into the executive boardrooms filled with skeptical underwriting bankers. He publicly praised ClearChain while I projected the transparent data dashboard onto the massive presentation screens. He looked those nervous investors directly in the eye and guaranteed them that Blackmere was incorruptible because my system made corruption mathematically impossible to hide. He secured the funding, won the massive contract, and happily took all the credit. But the absolute transparency that Nathan sold to the banks was the exact same transparency that his wife, Delia Holloway, violently resented. Delia did not see a municipal water project as a sacred public trust. She saw it as a private, highly lucrative feeding trough. She absolutely hated the reality that a piece of software could prevent people with her immense executive privilege from arbitrarily interfering with the project timeline. She loathed that ClearChain made it impossible for her to quietly steer massive supply contracts toward the preferred vendors owned by her personal friends and family members. She despised the fact that she could no longer manipulate the contractor selection process without leaving a bright, permanent digital footprint that screamed institutional fraud. My system forced the entire executive floor to operate with integrity, and Delia had built her entire prestigious career on the strategic absence of integrity. The first undeniable warning sign of her retaliation materialized exactly 3 months before my wedding day. Delia walked onto the engineering floor and proudly introduced her niece, Piper Shaw. Piper was 25 years old, holding a freshly printed degree from a mid-tier business program, and possessing absolutely zero practical background in municipal water infrastructure. Delia loudly announced to the entire floor that Piper was being brought onto the flagship project to provide a fresh perspective. It was a blatant, insulting display of nepotism disguised as corporate innovation. Over the next 12 weeks, Delia systematically and aggressively forced the senior department heads to integrate Piper into every major compliance meeting. She was carefully conditioning the entire management structure to get used to the idea that my voice was no longer the only one that mattered. Piper would sit at the heavy mahogany conference tables, tapping aimlessly on her expensive tablet, while I explained complex, life-saving chemical calibration protocols to the field operators. I should have recognized the immediate danger and fought back right then. I should have locked down the administrative protocols, but I was exhausted. I was managing the architecture of a billion-dollar regulatory system, finalizing the catering menus for my reception, and trying to maintain a flawless facade of professional grace under immense daily pressure. Then, the true nature of the underground alliance began to reveal itself. Grant Tully, the project operations director, was a man notoriously desperate to secure his lucrative quarterly performance bonuses. He cared only about finishing tasks under budget, regardless of the critical safety corners that had to be brutally cut. Grant immediately allied himself with Piper. Whenever I flagged a serious issue with a supplier whose materials failed our preliminary stress tests, Grant would intentionally bypass my desk entirely. He would turn his chair toward Piper and ask for her input. "Perhaps we can streamline this process," Piper would say, her soft voice echoing the exact demanding cadence of her aunt. "We should waive the standard secondary review period to maintain our forward momentum." "I completely agree with Piper," Grant would immediately chime in, waving his pen dismissively at my reports. "We need a fresh perspective, Quinn, not more bureaucratic roadblocks." I sat there and watched a silent, devastating coup forming right in front of my eyes. I realized that a shadow coalition was rapidly coalescing around Delia. Grant desperately wanted the fast, unchecked approvals to secure his money. Delia wanted total control over the lucrative vendor contracts to enrich her private network. And Piper simply wanted the prestige and the massive salary of a senior title without having to put in a decade of actual, grueling engineering work. Yet, despite seeing all the hostile pieces moving on the board, I did not sound the alarm. I did not file a formal grievance with the board of directors. I did not even march into Nathan's private office to demand an immediate intervention. My ultimate downfall was my own absolute, blind arrogance in the technology I had painstakingly created. I truly believed that ClearChain was an invincible fortress. I knew every single line of the code intimately. I knew that the internal architecture was so tightly woven that absolutely no one, not even a senior executive wielding master administrative privileges, could retroactively alter the document change history without triggering a catastrophic, system-wide lockdown. I thought I had built an indestructible, impenetrable digital wall around the entire infrastructure project. I was so wildly confident in the mathematical perfection of the software that I completely failed to account for the darkest elements of human desperation. My unwavering belief in the code entirely blinded me to the glaring, terrifying reality of their actual strategy. Delia Holloway, Grant Tully, and Piper Shaw were never trying to figure out how to hack into my digital vault. They were never preparing to attack the system itself. They were preparing to attack the only person who actually understood how to read the system. They finally realized that if they could not manipulate the historical records securely locked inside ClearChain, their only viable option was to permanently blind the watchdog. They needed to brutally sever my connection to the database at the exact moment they pushed their fraudulent, highly dangerous changes through the state regulatory portal. They patiently waited for the one day I would be entirely defenseless, surrounded by white flowers and my family, physically separated from my encrypted servers and completely unaware of the digital massacre happening in my absence. They did not break my system. They simply used my wedding day to lock me out of the building, fully believing their secrets were finally safe in the dark. Standing in the dim vestibule of the church, the echo of Luca's revelation finally began to synchronize with a conversation we had shared just days ago. He was not speaking from sudden paranoia. My husband had been watching a slow-motion train wreck developing inside the state regulatory databases for weeks. Luca worked in a drab, windowless office building in downtown Columbus, analyzing thousands of pages of municipal submissions. About 3 weeks before we stood at the altar, the automated compliance algorithms at the Clean Water Oversight Bureau had started spitting out localized anomaly reports. Blackmere Utilities Group was generating an unusual amount of system noise. The data being pushed to the state portal for the corridor project was no longer aligning with the archived preliminary engineering approvals. Luca had spent 3 late nights systematically peeling back the digital layers of the submitted documents, What he found was not a clerical error. It was a calculated, three-pronged assault on the structural integrity of the entire water treatment initiative. First, the primary filtration membranes. The original, rigorously tested specifications required high density, aerospace-grade polymer meshes designed to filter out microscopic heavy metals and industrial runoff. The new documents, quietly slipped into the state portal, downgraded those membranes to a commercial-grade synthetic. It was a cheaper, thinner material that would degrade twice as fast under high pressure. Second, the anti-corrosion chemical baselines. To keep the century-old lead pipes from leaching poison into the drinking supply, a highly specific volume of orthophosphate had to be continuously pumped through the municipal arteries. The altered documents slashed that required chemical volume by exactly 35%. Third, the sensor calibration schedule. The digital monitors testing the water purity were mandated to be recalibrated by an independent third party every 14 days. The new submissions stretched that mandatory window out to 90 days. Luca explained the terrifying logic behind these alterations. By downgrading the filters, cutting the chemical treatments, and reducing the independent inspections, someone inside Blackmere was instantly shaving tens of millions of dollars off the short-term operational budget. They were padding the immediate profit margins, but the trade-off was astronomical. They were gambling with the lives of hundreds of thousands of citizens. If those cheap membranes tore, or if the acidic water ate through the municipal pipes because the orthophosphate levels were too low, the resulting contamination would be a historic public health disaster. The resulting legal liability would completely obliterate the company. But the most damning piece of evidence Luca found was buried in the metadata. The digital timestamps attached to these three catastrophic modifications proved they had been uploaded a full 48 hours after the lead engineering team had digitally signed and locked the official approval sheets. Someone had waited for the engineers to finish their rigorous safety checks, and then that person had bypassed the internal review protocol to swap the safe documents with the compromised ones right before sending them to the state. Luca did not have the administrative passwords to enter my internal network. He could not see who was making the changes from inside Blackmere, but his years of regulatory experience told him exactly what the perpetrator was thinking. Whoever pushed those files was betting their entire career that the overworked state bureaucrats would never bother to cross-reference the final submission dates with the internal engineering approval logs. They were counting on institutional laziness. I squeezed my eyes shut, leaning my head against the cold stone pillar as the memory of our dinner rushed back. It was exactly 4 days before the wedding. We were sitting at our small kitchen table, surrounded by a chaotic sea of ivory envelopes, floral arrangement contracts, and seating charts. I was rubbing my temples, exhausted from a 12-hour shift fighting with Grant Tully over budget constraints. Luca had placed his hand over mine, completely ignoring the scattered wedding invitations. "Quinn," he had said, his voice unusually tight, "I need you to look into something when you get back to the office on Monday. The state portal is catching some really abnormal data transfers from your team. Things are not matching up." "What kind of abnormal?" I had asked, barely looking up from a spreadsheet of dietary restrictions for our guests. "Specification shifts," he replied. "Major ones. The kind that usually require a full board review. Are you guys doing a massive mid-phase redesign that nobody told the state about?" I had waved him off, completely consumed by my own exhaustion. "No, we are locked in. Grant has been complaining about material costs, but I shut him down. The system will not let him change a single valve without my authorization. I will run a diagnostic check next week after we get back from the coast. I promise. Just be careful." Luca had warned me, his dark eyes filled with a quiet, persistent worry. Whoever is touching those files is leaving a very messy trail. Do not let them drag your name into it. We had left it at that. We were entirely consumed by the blinding rush of our impending marriage. I had placed my absolute faith in the unbreakable code of my software, ignoring the very real possibility that the threat was not a glitch, but a person with a master key. Now, standing in the echo of the church vestibule, with the cruel termination text burning on my phone screen. The scattered fragments violently assembled themselves into a complete horrifying picture. The unauthorized modifications, the downgraded safety protocols, the sudden, forced integration of Piper Shaw into my department, Delia's constant, overbearing presence in the engineering wing, and finally, my sudden termination on the exact day, the exact hour, that I was legally and physically bound to be miles away from my servers. This was never about Delia Holloway asserting her executive dominance. This was never a petty, personal vendetta designed to embarrass me in front of my family. This was a meticulously timed corporate heist. The regulators were already asking questions, and Delia knew the audit logs would lead straight to the executive suite. Firing me was not an impulsive power move. It was an attempt to seize the system long enough to rewrite the story before the auditors arrived. I opened my eyes and looked at Luca. The upbeat jazz music pouring from the reception hall sounded completely grotesque now. My company was not just stealing money, they were actively dismantling the safety infrastructure of an entire region, and they were preparing to use me as the absolute scapegoat. They are going to erase the audit trails, I whispered, the reality of the situation freezing the blood in my veins. Delia put Piper in my chair so she can authorize a total system wipe. They are going to blame the mismatched files on a coding error in my platform. Luca nodded slowly, his expression hardening into something cold and incredibly dangerous. And if they succeed, they walk away with millions in saved costs, and you take the absolute fall for the compliance failure. You lose your license, your career, and potentially face federal charges for criminal negligence. The 10th phone call from Nathan Holloway finally stopped ringing. The screen went dark. A profound, terrifying silence settled between us. My hands, which had been shaking just moments ago, were now completely still. The shock was entirely gone, burned away by a sudden, absolute clarity. They thought they had trapped me. They thought they had perfectly synchronized their crime with my moment of greatest distraction. But they had miscalculated one critical, fatal detail. They assumed I had built a system that could be controlled by whoever sat in the administrative chair. They had no idea what I had actually built in the dark. The physical weight of the phone in my hand felt entirely different now. It was no longer a device for taking pictures of wedding cakes or reading congratulatory texts from distant relatives. It had become something far more dangerous than a phone. It was the one thing they suddenly needed, and they no longer controlled it. Luca gently guided me away from the cold stone pillars of the vestibule and pushed open the heavy oak doors leading to the main reception hall. A massive wave of sound instantly washed over us. A 10-piece jazz band was playing a lively brass tune. Waiters in crisp white shirts were weaving through the circular tables, carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes. Hundreds of guests turned their heads and erupted into a deafening applause the moment they saw us. I smiled. I nodded. I waved my hand. I played the role of the radiant, blissful bride perfectly. But beneath the layers of silk and tulle, my heart was beating with the slow, measured rhythm of a predator watching a trap spring shut. I slipped my phone into the hidden pocket sewn into the heavy skirt of my gown. It immediately buzzed against my thigh. Then it buzzed again. Then it vibrated in a long, continuous hum that meant someone was leaving a voice message. We made our way to the beautifully decorated sweetheart table at the front of the room. Luca pulled out my chair, his hand lingering reassuringly on the small of my back. As soon as we sat down, I reached into my pocket. "How bad is it?" Luca asked, his voice completely masked by the cheerful clinking of silverware against fine china. I slid the device onto my lap, hiding it beneath the thick linen tablecloth, and unlocked the screen. The notification panel was a chaotic wall of red alerts. There were 14 missed calls in the span of 20 minutes. 6 of them were from Nathan Holloway. 4 were from the chief legal counsel. 3 were from the director of finance. 1 was from the main executive switchboard. They were bleeding, and they finally realized I was the only person holding a tourniquet. "I need to hear these," I whispered to Luca. We waited for the best man to finish a loud, humorous toast, then quietly excused ourselves, slipping through a side door that led to the private bridal suite. The room was quiet, smelling of discarded hairspray and fresh roses. I sat on the edge of a velvet sofa, placed the phone on the glass coffee table, and pressed the speaker icon. The first voicemail began to play. "Quinn, it is Nathan." The chief executive officer usually spoke with the deep, booming confidence of a man who owned the room before he even walked into it. Now, his voice was remarkably thin, stretched tight like a wire about to snap. "There seems to be a severe misunderstanding regarding the project files. We are experiencing a minor system lockdown on the compliance dashboard. I need you to call me back the absolute second you hear this message. Tonight. It is imperative that we clear this up before Monday morning." I looked up at Luca. He crossed his arms over his tailored suit jacket, his face an unreadable mask. Nathan was lying. A system lockdown was not a minor misunderstanding. It was the digital equivalent of dropping blast doors over a nuclear reactor. The second voicemail started automatically. The span between the first call and the second call was only 8 minutes. But the deterioration in Nathan's composure was absolute. "Quinn, pick up the goddamn phone." The facade of executive control had completely evaporated. I could hear the chaotic, muffled sounds of shouting in the background, a stark contrast to the quiet elegance of my bridal suite. "The municipal bond fund managers just sent a priority demand letter. The city attorneys are threatening a total financial freeze on the operating accounts. Grant Tully pushed specification modifications without engineering sign-off, and the system flagged it as a critical breach. We cannot revert the files. Piper does not have the administrative keys. Call me right now." The message ended with a sharp click. I sat perfectly still, letting the sheer magnitude of his panic wash over me. Nathan was not calling to apologize for his wife firing me. He was calling because the fire Delia started was rapidly burning its way up to his office on the top floor. But there was something incredibly revealing hiding inside his desperate shouting. I played the message back in my mind, analyzing every single word. Nathan explicitly named Grant Tully. He threw his own director of operations directly under the moving bus without a second of hesitation. He admitted that Grant pushed the illegal changes. But Nathan carefully, deliberately omitted the most crucial piece of the puzzle. He never mentioned Delia. He never mentioned that Grant could only bypass the engineering sign-off if a senior executive provided a master override code. He never mentioned that his own wife was the one holding that code. Nathan was desperately trying to isolate the blame onto a middle manager, hoping I would simply log in, fix the code, and keep his wife's name completely out of the audit logs. He knew exactly what she had done, and he was terrified before I could even speak. A sharp chime cut through the silence of the room. A new text message illuminated the screen. It was not from Nathan. It was from Delia. I opened the message. There was no panic in her words. There was no desperate plea for technical assistance. There was only the cold, venomous arrogance of a woman who still believed she was untouchable. "Enjoy your honeymoon, Quinn. Let the adults handle the company business." I stared at the glowing white letters. A slow, genuine smile finally spread across my face. It was the most beautiful thing I had read all day. "What did she say?" Luca asked, stepping closer to look over my shoulder. I handed him the phone. He read the short, insulting sentence, and let out a dry, humorless laugh. "She does not know," I said softly, the realization crystallizing into pure strategy. Nathan is having a total meltdown because the lawyers and the bankers are screaming at him. But Delia still thinks this is just a minor glitch. She thinks her husband is just yelling at the information technology department to reset a password. She has absolutely no idea that the state regulatory board is already watching them burn. If Delia was still calm enough to send a condescending insult, it meant she had not grasped the true severity of the situation. Answering Nathan's phone calls would give them an anchor. It would give them a target to yell at, someone to blame, someone to threaten. Engaging with them would only help them organize their defense. So, what is the play? Luca asked, handing the phone back to me. I looked down at the device. I thought about the 4 years of 80-hour work weeks. I thought about the stress, the endless arguments with Grant, the blatant disrespect from Delia, and the utter betrayal of receiving a termination notice moments after kissing my husband at the altar. Sometimes, Luca said quietly, breaking the silence before I could formulate an answer, the most expensive decision a corporation can ever make is forcefully evicting the exact person holding the only map out of the minefield. He was absolutely right. They wanted me to panic. They wanted me to cry over my lost job and scramble to fix their mess in a desperate attempt to win back their favor. They wanted me to act like a loyal employee who had just been disciplined. But I was not their employee anymore. Delia had made that extremely clear. I held down the power button on the side of the device. A prompt appeared on the screen, asking for confirmation. I swiped my finger across the glass. The screen went pitch black, plunging the corporate crisis into absolute silence. I did not need to scream at them. I did not need to threaten a lawsuit. I did not need to explain how badly they had miscalculated. My absence was going to say more than any argument I could make that night. I tossed the dead phone onto the velvet cushions of the sofa. I stood up, smoothing the heavy silk of my wedding dress, and looked at my husband. "The adults can handle it," I said, repeating Delia's words with a deep, profound sense of satisfaction. "Come on. They are playing our song." We walked out of the quiet room and back into the brilliant light of the reception hall. The band was starting a slow, romantic melody. Luca led me to the center of the polished wooden dance floor. He wrapped his arms around my waist, and I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady, calm rhythm of his heart as we swayed under the warm glow of the chandeliers. I felt lighter than I had in years. I closed my eyes and smiled into the fabric of his suit. For the first time all night, I truly understood the devastating power I now held. My silence was not a surrender. It was a suffocating, inescapable trap, and I was going to let them choke on it. Let their phones ring. Let their lawyers panic. Let their empire burn. I was exactly where I wanted to be. We boarded our flight to South Carolina at exactly 8 o'clock the following morning. The sky over Ohio was a heavy, suffocating gray, threatening rain, but I felt entirely unburdened. Deep inside my carry-on luggage, securely zipped beneath 2 layers of clothing, my powered-down phone remained a silent tomb for Blackmere Utilities Group. Luca and I held hands across the narrow armrest as the plane climbed above the clouds, leaving the corporate panic thousands of feet below us. By early afternoon, we arrived at a secluded boutique hotel perched directly against the Atlantic coastline. The air was thick with the smell of sea salt and blooming jasmine. From the massive windows of our corner suite, the ocean looked vast and rhythmic, a steady, unstoppable force of nature. It was supposed to be a sanctuary of peace for our honeymoon. Yet, beneath the tranquil surface of our seaside retreat, a massive, unseen wave was rapidly building far offshore, threatening to wash away everything my former employers had built. While I was unpacking my suitcase, Luca sat at the small mahogany desk near the balcony, booting up his secured work laptop. He had requested a temporary remote access token from the Clean Water Oversight Bureau before we left. He was not supposed to be working, but the anomaly he had spotted was too dangerous to ignore. "They did it," Luca said, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the ocean breeze drifting through the open sliding glass door. I stopped folding a linen dress and turned toward him. "Did what?" "The state regulators finally dropped the hammer," he replied, his eyes scanning the dense columns of text on his glowing screen. "The automated flagging system reached its critical threshold late last night. The Ohio Oversight Board officially opened a formal, comprehensive review into the Great Lakes Renewal Corridor. And more importantly, they just instituted a temporary freeze on the next phase of disbursement applications." I walked over and stood behind his chair, resting my hands on his shoulders. The state freezing the funds was the absolute worst-case scenario for Nathan Holloway. when dealing with a $2.3 billion public infrastructure initiative. Cash flow is the only oxygen the project has. How much did they freeze? I asked, my mind already calculating the devastating financial ripple effects. The entire third quarter operational budget, Luca answered grimly. That is nearly $85 million effectively locked in a bureaucratic vault until Blackmere can legally justify the specification changes to a panel of angry state auditors. I stepped away from the desk and paced across the hardwood floor of the suite. The technical ramifications began to unfold in my head like a collapsing house of cards. I started to piece together exactly why Nathan had been screaming into my voicemail the night before. It is the insurance, I said out loud, piecing the puzzle together. The municipal bonds funding this project are strictly underwritten by massive liability insurance policies. Those insurance actuaries price their risk models based on the original, safe engineering designs. If Grant Tully secretly swapped the high-grade filtration membranes for cheap synthetics, and if he drastically reduced the anti-corrosion chemical baselines, the entire structural integrity of the water system is compromised. Luca turned his chair to face me, which means the original risk profile is completely void. Exactly, I confirmed, feeling the cold logic click into place. If the filters fail and a township gets sick, the damages would be in the hundreds of millions. The insurance companies will immediately argue that Blackmere breached the terms of their coverage by altering the approved materials without notifying the underwriters. The second the bond issuers realize they are no longer insured against a catastrophic public health failure, they will panic and demand their initial investments back. That is why the lawyers were calling me. They need someone to swear that the altered files are just a computer glitch, not a deliberate breach of contract. Just as I finished explaining the cascading financial doom, my personal tablet, which I had connected to the secure hotel wireless network, chimed softly from the bedside table. I walked over and picked it up. It was a message on an encrypted, peer-to-peer communication application I rarely used. The sender was an old, trusted source buried deep within the technical operations department back at Blackmere. We had worked closely together for 3 years before Delia started isolating my team. The message was brief, urgent, and incredibly revealing. Things are completely melting down here, the message read. Grant Tully came onto the floor at 6 o'clock this morning. He literally forced the site managers to accept a new batch of vendor certifications for the replacement filtration materials. But he absolutely refused to let the chief structural engineer look at the original physical documents. He just shoved a digital summary sheet in her face and told her it was an executive order. Everyone is terrified. I read the message twice, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic drumbeat against my ribs. I handed the tablet to Luca. Grant is hiding the paper trail, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He is not just using cheaper materials. He is using materials that might not even possess legitimate safety certifications. But why? Why risk destroying a $2 billion contract just to save a few million on supplies? Luca read the message, his brow furrowing in deep concentration. When does the financial quarter end? God, Friday. I answered instantly. 5 days from now. That is the deadline, Luca concluded, his fingers already flying across his keyboard as he opened a new browser tab. They are not just trying to save money on the overall budget. They are desperately trying to execute a specific material purchase and push the invoice through the accounting department before the quarterly books are closed and audited. They need the state to release that frozen $85 million so they can immediately pay this new, mysterious supplier. A dark, incredibly cynical suspicion began to take root in the back of my mind. In the cutthroat world of corporate infrastructure, sudden vendor changes pushed through hidden executive channels were rarely about efficiency. They were almost always about greed. Luca, I said, stepping closer to the screen, look up the new vendor. The state portal has to list the corporate entity that submitted the revised supply bids. He nodded, accessing the public procurement registries for the state of Ohio. The search took several intense minutes of navigating through dense bureaucratic portals and downloading poorly scanned PDF documents. Finally, He isolated the updated procurement sheet Grant Tully had attempted to quietly slip past the regulators. "Here it is," Luca announced. "The new filtration membranes are being sourced from a company called Apex Industrial Solutions. They are a limited liability corporation registered in Delaware just 8 months ago." 8 months ago, I repeated, the timeline perfectly matching the exact month Delia Holloway began heavily interfering with my department. "Run the registered agent. Pierce the corporate veil. Let us see who actually owns Apex Industrial Solutions." Luca pulled up a specialized financial database he used for state background checks, typing in the registration numbers. The screen loaded, filtering through layers of shell companies, holding groups, and proxy directors designed to obscure the true ownership. Then, the final layer peeled away, revealing a registered family trust fund that acted as the primary financial beneficiary for the supplier. Luca stopped typing. He stared at the screen for a long, heavy moment before looking up at me. The expression on his face was a mixture of absolute shock and profound disgust. "The primary beneficiary of the trust fund that owns Apex Industrial Solutions," Luca said, his voice completely devoid of emotion, "is a man named Richard Vance." The name hit me like a physical strike. I had to grip the edge of the mahogany desk to steady myself. I knew that name. Everyone in the executive suite knew that name. Richard Vance was Delia Holloway's older brother. The room spun wildly for a fraction of a second before snapping into a terrifying, crystal-clear focus. The final, massive piece of the puzzle slammed violently into place. This was never a standard story of corporate negligence or a misguided attempt to secure an end-of-year performance bonus. This was a highly coordinated, multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. Delia was systematically funneling massive public infrastructure funds directly out of the Great Lakes Renewal Corridor and straight into her own family's pockets. She was doing it by forcing the company to buy dangerously substandard materials from a fake supply company owned by her brother at highly inflated prices. Suddenly, my brutal termination on my wedding day made perfect, horrific sense. Delia did not fire me simply to remove a stubborn compliance officer who refused to bend the rules. She fired me to completely blind the internal tracking system. ClearChain was specifically designed to trace the exact origin of every single dollar spent on materials. If I had been sitting at my desk when Grant Tully tried to process that invoice to Apex Industrial Solutions, my software would have immediately flagged the vendor, cross-referenced the ownership, and exposed the familial conflict of interest to the entire board of directors. Delia had to execute me professionally because I was the only person in the entire corporate structure capable of reading the map that showed exactly how she was robbing the city blind. I looked out the window at the crashing waves of the Atlantic Ocean. The honeymoon was over. The woman who told me to let the adults handle the company business was currently committing federal procurement fraud, violating municipal bond agreements, and risking the drinking water of an entire state. She thought burying me would cover her tracks. She had absolutely no idea that she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy her. When the return flight from South Carolina finally touched down on the tarmac in Ohio, the air inside the cabin felt completely different than when we had departed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of a sudden corporate betrayal. It was the sharp, clarifying air of a newly declared war. I reached into my bag, retrieved my powered-down phone, and finally held the power button. The screen lit up and immediately started vibrating as days of blocked notifications flooded in. Nathan Holloway had fundamentally transitioned from a panicked executive shouting into a voicemail to a desperate man trying to legally purchase a lifeline. His name dominated my email inbox. He had sent 3 separate, highly formal employment offers over the past 4 days. He was no longer demanding my immediate return to the office. He was virtually begging on his hands and knees. The chief executive officer officially offered to completely restore my former title as the head of internal compliance. He attached a legally binding document proposing a 40% salary increase, a massive 6-figure retention bonus payable immediately upon signing, and a highly generous allocation of long-term corporate equity shares. He was desperately trying to buy my silence by pretending he was buying my loyalty. He wanted me back inside the building so he could control me. I calmly deleted every single email without sending a reply. I was never stepping foot inside Blackmere Utilities Group again. Instead of reclaiming my old mahogany desk, I spent my first week back in Columbus, signing a commercial lease for a modest, sunlit office space on the second floor of a brick building downtown. I formally registered a new corporate entity and bolted a polished brass plaque next to the door. It read Blue Ledger Compliance. I was no longer a salaried employee bound by restrictive non-disclosure agreements and oppressive executive hierarchies. I was now an independent, specialized consultant. My firm had one highly specific mission: designing and auditing rigorous, tamper-proof approval tracking systems for high-risk public infrastructure projects. The timing of my new venture could not have been better. The temporary funding freeze the state had slapped on the Great Lakes Renewal Corridor had sent massive, terrifying shockwaves through the entire municipal construction sector. The massive international lenders, the strict corporate insurance firms, and the cautious state licensing agencies were all suddenly looking at Blackmere and realizing a horrifying truth. The entire industry possessed a massive, gaping vulnerability in administrative governance. If a flagship infrastructure project could be internally hijacked by its own executives without triggering immediate public alarms, every single underwriter was exposed to catastrophic financial risk. They desperately needed an independent architect to build unassailable digital walls. And I was the undisputed, highly publicized expert in exactly that field. My sudden availability did not go unnoticed by the industry watchers. An anonymous trade publication circulating widely among infrastructure investors and bond issuers published a highly speculative, deeply researched article about the administrative chaos currently engulfing Blackmere. The headline did not mention my name, but the author referred to me simply as the woman fired in her wedding dress. The article heavily implied that this nameless woman was possibly the only person who truly understood why a multi-billion-dollar public works initiative was rapidly collapsing from the inside out. Blackmere immediately deployed their aggressive public relations machinery to control the bleeding narrative. Their official press releases carefully avoided mentioning the frozen state funds, the downgraded filtration membranes, or the ongoing oversight review. Instead, they fed the industry a heavily sanitized, deeply insulting story. They officially claimed that the internal compliance software I had designed was unnecessarily convoluted, creating a bottleneck in project efficiency. They confidently assured the municipal bondholders that the current administrative gridlock was nothing more than the unfortunate consequence of a bumpy personnel transition. They framed Delia's niece, Piper Shaw, as a brilliant young manager valiantly struggling to simplify a broken, overly complicated system left behind by a disgruntled former employee. The visceral urge to publicly defend my professional reputation was intense. I wanted to release a fiery statement. I wanted to go on the record with the business journals and explain exactly how the system was mathematically perfect until a senior executive intentionally bypassed the security protocols to enrich her own family. But I forced myself to remain completely silent. A public war of words would only allow Delia to drag me into a subjective, messy mudslinging contest. I knew from years of building compliance frameworks that the absolute best counterattack was never an emotional press conference. The ultimate weapon was irrefutable, cold documentation. I needed to assemble a complete, panoramic picture of their corruption before I finally struck the match. That is when Lucas stepped in to bridge the critical gap between my digital records and the human element of the crime. My husband utilized his deep network within the state regulatory community to quietly connect me with two people who possessed the exact puzzle pieces I was missing. They were individuals who could easily become the absolute key witnesses when the state auditors finally convened a formal hearing. The first was Tessa Bloom. She was the brilliant lead structural engineer who had spent 3 years ensuring the corridor project met every single state safety mandate. We met at a quiet, dimly lit coffee shop on the completely opposite side of the city from the Blackmere headquarters. Tessa looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed with the intense stress of working under a compromised, hostile management structure. She confirmed exactly what I had suspected since my honeymoon. "They completely locked me out of the approval chain," Tessa said. her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and deep fatigue as she gripped a warm ceramic mug. Grant Tully completely stopped sending me the physical specification sheets for the new water filtration materials. Whenever I explicitly demanded to see the original manufacturer's certifications, Piper Shaw would intervene. She would stand in my doorway and tell me the executive suite had already cleared the vendors to save time. They are installing substandard materials that will absolutely fail the required pressure tests. Quinn, and worse, the system is showing that my department approved it. They are operating in the dark. The second connection Luca facilitated was with Evan Pike. Evan was a meticulous municipal bond specialist who had abruptly resigned from the Blackmere Financial Department exactly 6 months ago. We met him the following afternoon in a secluded park near the riverfront. Evan had walked away from a highly lucrative career because he had seen the early warning signs of Delia's financial manipulation and absolutely refused to be legally implicated when the bomb finally detonated. The covenant agreements on those municipal bonds are incredibly strict, Evan explained, leaning against a wooden fence and watching the water flow past. He spoke with the rapid, precise cadence of a man who read financial law for fun. Blackmere is legally required to officially notify the bondholders of any significant material changes to the project scope within 14 days. Delia deliberately structured these new supply contracts to bypass that notification window. If the state auditors prove she is funneling public funds into a shell company owned by her brother, it is not just a standard breach of contract. It is a massive, deliberate securities fraud. The bondholders will pull their capital instantly, and the company will be forced into federal receivership. As I drove home that evening, the steering wheel felt solid and grounding beneath my hands. The reality of my new position settled over me with a deep, empowering clarity. When Delia sent that cruel text message on my wedding day, she genuinely thought she was banishing me to the absolute bottom of the professional food chain. She thought that stripping me of my corporate title and locking me out of my office would render me completely powerless, a weeping bride crying over a lost paycheck. She could not have been more catastrophically wrong. By forcefully ejecting me from the company, she had inadvertently removed the only legal chains holding me back. I was no longer an employee bound by a strict duty of confidentiality to protect Blackmere Utilities Group. I was an independent auditor standing completely outside the blast radius. From a woman abruptly fired on her wedding day, I had rapidly transitioned into a position that was infinitely more dangerous to Delia Holloway. I was an outsider with absolutely nothing left to lose, holding the exact blueprints that showed precisely where the structural integrity of her corrupt empire was going to violently fracture. They thought forcing me out had weakened me. In reality, it had put me in a far stronger position. The invitation arrived not through official corporate channels, but via a handwritten note delivered by a private courier directly to my newly leased office. Nathan Holloway requested my immediate presence at an exclusive, members-only hotel situated in the wealthiest district of downtown Columbus. The parameters of the meeting were explicitly clear. There were to be no executive assistants, no legal representatives, no audio recordings, and absolutely no official minutes taken. It was a phantom meeting, entirely off the books, designed meticulously to leave zero trace in the corporate logs. When I walked into the dimly lit, mahogany-paneled private lounge on the top floor of the hotel, Nathan was already waiting. He was sitting alone in a high-backed leather chair, nursing a glass of dark amber liquid. The man who usually commanded massive boardrooms with his booming, unshakable confidence looked physically diminished. His custom-tailored suit hung slightly looser on his frame, and the deep, dark lines etched around his eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights since the state regulatory board officially froze the project funding. "Thank you for coming," Nathan said, gesturing weakly to the empty leather chair positioned directly across from him. His voice was hushed, carefully engineered to sound intimate and entirely reasonable. I sat down, placing my leather bag on the floor beside me, and simply folded my hands in my lap. I did not thank him for the secret invitation. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply waited, allowing the heavy, oppressive silence to stretch out between us until he was physically forced to fill the void. Nathan leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on his knees, adopting the posture of a deeply burdened and exhausted man. "I want to apologize to you," he began, his tone dripping with a practiced, desperate sincerity. "What happened on your wedding day was entirely inexcusable. Delia went too far. I was completely blindsided by her actions. She let her personal ego and her aggressive management style dictate a catastrophic human resources decision. Grant Tully completely betrayed my trust to cover up his own operational failures on the ground. And Piper. Well, Piper is just a kid pushed up as a shield for their massive administrative mess. I am just a husband and a chief executive officer trying to pull my company out of a fatal tailspin that they created behind my back." I kept my expression entirely neutral, quietly studying the micro-expressions on his face. It was a truly masterful performance. He was actively, ruthlessly attempting to amputate the infected limbs of his own executive team, including his own wife, in a desperate bid to save the central organ of his own career. He was painting himself as the tragic, unknowing victim of a conspiracy he had supposedly just discovered. "That is a very compelling narrative, Nathan," I replied evenly, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. But heartfelt apologies do not unfreeze $85 million in state funds. He flinched slightly at my cold directness, his jaw tightening for a fraction of a second before he smoothed his features back into a mask of cooperative distress. "Which is exactly why we are having this highly private conversation today. The state regulators and the municipal bondholders are rapidly expanding their audit. They are aggressively demanding a full historical account of the specification changes regarding the filtration systems. I need you back in the building. I am fully prepared to offer you complete departmental autonomy, a massive increase in your operational budget, and a direct, unfiltered reporting line exclusively to me." "I already have my own firm now," I reminded him softly, watching his eyes. Nathan waved his hand dismissively, as if my new business was just a temporary hobby. "Then come back as an independent consultant. I will personally authorize a check for triple whatever you are charging your current clients. I just need you to come into the network and help us identify the correct file version. I need you to help us sort out this localized administrative nightmare before the State Oversight Committee decides to permanently dismantle the entire infrastructure project." I listened to the precise, calculated cadence of his words. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Nathan was not speaking like a visionary leader trying to protect the integrity of a massive public utility. He was speaking like a deeply terrified man desperately attempting to control the exact sequence of the truth being exposed to the sunlight. "Identifying the correct file version is not a complicated task, Nathan," I said, leaning back into the leather chair. "My system strictly logs every single keystroke. The correct version is the one digitally signed by the lead structural engineer, Tessa Bloom, exactly 48 hours before Grant Tully bypassed the internal locks to upload the fraudulent vendor sheets." Nathan took a slow, deliberate sip of his drink, his eyes darting nervously toward the heavy wooden door of the lounge before returning to my face. "It is not quite that simple," he murmured, his voice dropping even lower. "There are internal executive communications that deeply complicate the legal timeline. The procurement strategy shift was discussed at the highest levels of the company. There is a specific internal memo locked in the executive vault outlining the absolute necessity of finding alternative supply chains to meet our quarterly financial deadlines." For a second, everything else in the room seemed to fall away. A sudden freezing chill washed down my spine, settling heavily in the pit of my stomach as my mind processed the monumental mistake he had just made. The executive vault was not a physical safe located behind a painting in a corner office. It was a highly encrypted, deeply classified digital partition within the Blackmere primary server network, according to the strict security architecture I had personally designed and coded from scratch. Only 3 specific individuals in the entire global corporation possessed the multi-factor security clearance required to access, read, or generate documents within that specific, isolated vault: the chief legal counsel, Delia Holloway, and Nathan himself. If Nathan knew the precise contents of a memo locked securely inside that vault detailing the alternative supply chains, he could not possibly be the innocent, blindsided husband he was pretending to be. He knew about the Apex Industrial Solutions contract. He knew about the substandard, dangerous filtration membranes. He knew Delia was actively funneling the public project capital toward her brother's private shell company. He knew all of it. And he had actively allowed it to happen because he desperately needed the quarterly financial numbers to look flawless for his international board of directors. He had just accidentally revealed his own deep complicity, entirely unprompted, simply because he was too panicked to keep his intricate web of lies straight. I did not widen my eyes. I did not gasp. I maintained a gaze so steady and cold that he physically shifted in his seat, suddenly uncomfortable under my scrutiny. If the state regulators gain access to that vault, Nathan continued, completely oblivious to the massive strategic error he had just committed, the optics will be completely devastating to the firm. They will intentionally misinterpret a standard, aggressive cost-saving strategy as a deliberate, criminal breach of contract. He set his crystal glass down on the small table between us. The sharp clink of the glass sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He leaned in much closer, the heavy scent of his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of alcohol. The carefully constructed mask of the innocent victim finally slipped away entirely, revealing the raw, ugly, terrifying desperation underneath. We absolutely need to control the narrative here. Quinn, Nathan said, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that bordered on physical violence. If you confirm ClearChain was misconfigured during the transition phase, everything might still be salvageable. If you testify to the oversight board that the software catastrophically malfunctioned when Piper took over, causing the timestamps to scramble and the wrong files to be accidentally uploaded to the state portal, I can protect the company. I can protect my family from federal indictments. And I swear to you, I will make sure you never have to worry about money for the rest of your natural life. There it was, the absolute, undeniable bottom line. Nathan had not called me there to hire me back. He had called because he was terrified. In trying to buy my silence, he had given me exactly what I needed, proof that he knew far more than he claimed. The text message arrived late on a Tuesday evening, consisting of nothing but an address for an underground parking garage on the south side of the city and a specific time, 9 o'clock. I recognized the phone number immediately, even without a saved contact name. It belonged to Piper Shaw. I drove to the heavy concrete structure just outside the commercial district. The air inside the garage was damp and cold, echoing hollowly with the sound of distant highway traffic. Piper was standing alone, leaning nervously against the concrete pillar next to her expensive silver sedan. She looked entirely different from the arrogant 25-year-old who used to sit in my engineering meetings, dismissively tapping on her tablet and parroting her aunt's aggressive corporate jargon. Tonight, she was trembling. Her heavy wool coat was pulled tightly around her shoulders, and her face was pale under the flickering fluorescent lights. But her eyes held a sharp, desperate clarity. She was not completely broken. She was surviving. And survival always breeds a very specific kind of ruthless honesty. I did not know, Piper said the exact moment I stepped out of my car, her voice echoing slightly in the vast, empty space. I wanted your title. Quinn. I will admit that to you right now. My aunt told me it was a massive step up, a fast track to the executive suite, and I was greedy enough to take it without asking the right questions. But I swear to you, I did not understand the sheer magnitude of what I was actually walking into. I crossed my arms, deliberately keeping a significant physical distance between us. You walked into a $2.3 billion federal fraud scheme, Piper. You took over the internal compliance architecture of a public water utility. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense when the state auditors start handing out federal indictments. Piper swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she pulled them out of her coat pockets. Delia forced me to sign a massive stack of process acceptance forms the morning of your wedding. She locked the door to her office and told me it was just standard transition paperwork to legally authorize my new administrative access. She said we had to move quickly because you had left the system in a state of unmanageable chaos. But when I finally logged into the primary compliance dashboard on Monday morning and started digging through the weekend logs, I saw the truth. The administrative account that actually pushed those late-night approvals for the new filtration membranes was not mine. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, black encrypted flash drive, holding it out to me like it was burning her skin. This is a complete, raw data export from my secure work phone. I downloaded absolutely everything before leaving the executive suite today. There is a specific text message thread between Delia and Grant Tully from the late afternoon of your wedding. She explicitly ordered him to force the new vendor sheets through the state portal. Her exact words were that they had to complete the upload before Monday, before Quinn returns and starts asking questions. I took the drive from her shaking hand. The cold metal casing felt heavy with the weight of absolute destruction. The scattered pieces of the puzzle were rapidly interlocking in my mind. This data export perfectly corroborated the final fragments of evidence I had painstakingly gathered over the past 48 hours through my own independent channels. Just yesterday afternoon, Tessa Bloom, the lead structural engineer, had provided a crucial piece of the technical timeline. She confirmed that she had explicitly and aggressively refused to sign the revised specification sheets for the new water filters. The replacement membranes from Apex Industrial Solutions did not just lack the proper independent safety certifications. Tessa had run the complex baseline mathematical models on the synthetic polymers and realized their maximum operational lifespan was barely 30% of the original materials required by the municipal bidding contract. They were absolutely guaranteed to fail and rupture within 3 years, not the mandated 30 years. It was a ticking public health time bomb, and Tessa had officially documented her refusal to authorize the downgrade. Furthermore, Evan Pike's quiet insight regarding the municipal bondholders suddenly cast a blinding, unforgiving light on the entire executive floor. Evan had verified that the primary financial underwriters had officially warned Blackmere 6 weeks ago. They had sent a highly classified memo explicitly stating that any significant deviation in material quality or supplier contracts would immediately trigger a mandatory comprehensive financial review and a potential freeze of all capital. Nathan Holloway was completely aware of that strict parameter. He knew that changing the supplier to his brother-in-law's shell company would jeopardize the entire funding structure if the bondholders found out. I plugged the black flash drive into the secure tablet I had brought with me and opened the raw data files while Piper stood nervously in the freezing air. I bypassed the standard text message screenshots and dug straight into the deep system access logs Piper had somehow managed to export from her terminal. I scanned the dense alphanumeric strings, tracking the exact moment the fraudulent documents were pushed to the state regulatory portal. Suddenly, a very specific sequence of encrypted characters stopped my breath entirely. I stared at the glowing screen, my mind racing through the mathematical architecture of Clear Chain. "Quinn," Piper whispered, stepping slightly closer, watching my face change. "What is it? What did you find?" "The master override code," I replied, my voice dangerously quiet. "I designed the Clear Chain platform to require a master executive override for any fundamental changes made after the final engineering sign-off. It is the highest level of security in the building. I always assumed your aunt used her own senior operations credentials to force the system open while I was standing at the altar exchanging my vows." I turned the tablet around, pointing to the glowing digital signature attached to the emergency bypass. But she did not use her operations code. The digital footprint attached to this specific breach belongs exclusively to the Chief Executive Officer. It was Nathan's personal master key. The pathetic, desperate narrative Nathan had tried to sell me in that private hotel lounge completely shattered into a million pieces. He was not a victim. He was not a helpless, overwhelmed husband trying to clean up his ambitious wife's administrative mess. He was the chief architect of the entire operation. The CEO override code required a synchronized dual authentication sequence. Delia could not simply guess a highly randomized cipher, nor could she steal it from his desk without triggering a secondary biometric alert on his personal device. Nathan either explicitly handed her the digital keys to the vault, Or he sat at his own desk and typed them in himself while I was walking down the aisle. He was completely unequivocally complicit from the very first second. Yet, as I stared at the irrefutable proof of his direct involvement, the cold, cynical reality of corporate law settled heavily over me. This was a massive revelation, but it was still not the absolute killing blow I needed. I knew exactly how their high-priced defense attorneys would spin this specific dataset in a federal courtroom. Blackmere would simply claim that their internal network had been sophisticatedly compromised by an outside threat. They would argue that a malicious actor had stolen the executive codes, manipulated the internal files, and perfectly framed the leadership team. They would blame a catastrophic system security failure, subtly pointing the legal finger right back at the original architect of the software, me. I needed an unbroken, mathematically perfect chain of custody. I needed to prove not just that the code was used, but that it could not possibly have been stolen, altered, or fabricated after the fact. I needed the one thing Blackmere did not know existed. Piper zipped her heavy coat all the way up to her chin, her eyes wide with a mixture of profound awe and absolute terror as she watched me silently process the data. She had finally realized the sheer, unmanageable scale of the monster she had enthusiastically decided to feed for a promotion. "Are you going to fix this, Quinn?" Piper asked, her voice incredibly small, echoing pathetically against the brutal concrete walls of the parking garage. "Are you going to step in and save the company before the state auditors arrest all of us?" I slowly removed the flash drive from my tablet and slipped it securely into the inside pocket of my jacket. I looked at the young woman who had proudly sat at my desk, used my equipment, and tried to wear my crown, completely oblivious to the massive guillotine hanging directly above her neck. "I am an independent auditor now. Piper," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth, sympathy, or professional courtesy. "My job is to precisely identify structural failures, not to repair them for criminals. I have absolutely no obligation to save the people who deliberately chose to kick me out the door at the exact moment they decided to commit a massive fraud." I turned around and walked toward my car, the sound of my footsteps sharp and rhythmic against the concrete floor. I was not going to save Blackmere Utilities Group. I was going to let them build their own gallows, and I was going to comfortably provide the State Oversight Committee with the exact measurements of the rope. The State of Ohio Oversight Bureau finally ran out of patience. The heavy mahogany doors of the private corporate boardrooms were permanently kicked open. At 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning, the state officially announced a mandatory, televised public hearing regarding the Great Lakes Renewal Corridor. It was no longer a quiet, contained internal audit. They aggressively subpoenaed the executive representatives from Blackmere Utilities Group, the entire Marlow City Council, the primary bondholders, and the head directors of the environmental licensing agencies. The corporate crisis was officially a massive public spectacle, and the clock was rapidly ticking down to zero, exactly 24 hours before the hearing was scheduled to commence. A senior partner from a ruthless corporate defense firm walked into my small downtown office. He did not bother with pleasantries or formal introductions. He placed a thick cream-colored envelope directly onto my desk. It contained a legally binding settlement offer orchestrated directly by Delia Holloway. The terms were absolutely staggering. She was offering me a lump sum of $3 million to be wired to an account of my choosing by the end of the business day. In exchange, I had to sign an ironclad, lifetime non-disclosure agreement and publicly testify under oath that the internal compliance system had simply lost control during a clumsy, unfortunate personnel transition. Furthermore, the document included a vicious clause promising that Blackmere would formally agree not to sue me for corporate sabotage if I played along. Delia was desperately trying to buy her own innocence, using the exact same massive pool of wealth she was actively stealing from the public. Less than an hour after the lawyer left, my encrypted inbox chimed. It was a direct message from Nathan Holloway. While his wife wielded financial threats like a blunt instrument, the chief executive officer attempted a much softer, far more insidious approach. He completely ignored the impending legal doom and instead pitched a brilliant, highly lucrative future for my newly established consulting firm. Nathan promised to personally introduce Blue Ledger compliance to the highest levels of the National Infrastructure Planning Committees. He practically guaranteed me a monopoly on federal compliance contracts for the next decade. His only condition was explicitly typed at the very bottom of the message. I need you to help me keep family matters from becoming criminal matters tomorrow. It was absolutely brazen. He was actively trying to recruit me into his criminal enterprise by offering me the keys to a corporate kingdom built entirely on fraud. That evening, the heavy weight of the impending hearing settled over our apartment like a thick, suffocating fog. Luca stood by the kitchen island, meticulously reviewing the printed transcripts of the accesses logs Piper had smuggled out of the building. His face was a mask of cold, analytical dread. "This is incredibly dangerous, Quinn," Luca said, tapping his pen aggressively against the granite countertop. "I know exactly how these state regulatory hearings operate. If you walk into that chamber tomorrow relying solely on the exported data Piper gave you, their defense attorneys will absolutely slaughter you on the stand. They will completely dismiss the logs as fabricated evidence." I poured 2 glasses of water, my hands perfectly steady. The logs contain Nathan's exact administrative signature. "It does not matter," Luca countered, his voice rising with genuine protective panic. "They will expertly paint you as a bitter, vindictive former employee who is desperately seeking revenge for being fired on her wedding day. They will argue that you intentionally hard-coded a backdoor into the software just so you could log in remotely, frame the entire executive team, and extort them for a massive financial settlement. They have an absolute army of corporate lawyers ready to bury you in reasonable doubt. Half-baked evidence is worse than no evidence at all. It gives them the exact ammunition they need to destroy your credibility forever." I walked over to the kitchen island, stood right in front of my husband, and offered him a slow, perfectly calm smile. It was the smile of someone who had quietly prepared for exactly this kind of moment. "You are absolutely right, Luca," I said softly, picking up my glass of water. "If my only proof came from inside their corrupted network, they would crush me before lunch. But they made one fatal, incredibly arrogant assumption when they designed their little hostile takeover. Delia and Nathan fundamentally believed that firing me and seizing my physical computer would permanently cut me off from the system history. I opened my personal laptop and bypassed the standard operating system, logging into a highly secure, heavily encrypted virtual portal. They never bothered to ask how I secured the international municipal bonds in the first place. When I originally built ClearChain, I knew the primary investors would demand an absolute guarantee against corporate tampering. So, I wrote a hidden protocol into the foundational architecture. Every single time a document is approved, altered, or bypassed, the system does not just save it to the Blackmere internal servers. Luca leaned in, his dark eyes widening as he stared at the complex streams of data flowing across my screen. "Where does it go?" "It simultaneously generates a read-only, cryptographic duplicate," I explained, the absolute thrill of the trap finally springing shut echoing in my chest. "And it automatically deposits that duplicate directly into an independent data escrow server managed by a blind, third-party trust tied explicitly to the municipal bond covenant. It is legally classified as investor property. Blackmere does not own the server. They do not host it. They do not even possess the administrative rights to view it. And most importantly, they absolutely cannot alter a single line of code inside of it." The realization washed over Luca's face, replacing his dread with profound, absolute shock. The timestamps, the override codes, and the altered specifications were all preserved on an independent escrow server far from Blackmere's headquarters. While the executives were busy cleaning up their internal records, they had no idea that a protected duplicate had existed from the beginning. The clock struck 11 at night, while the Blackmere executives were undoubtedly pacing their luxurious penthouses, finalizing their fabricated testimonies and practicing their innocent expressions in the mirror. I was not sitting at home preparing a victim statement. I was sitting in a small, poorly lit conference room inside the Marlow Municipal Building, Sitting directly across from me were three deeply terrified members of the Regional Clean Water Authority. They were staring down the barrel of a $2.3 billion canceled contract and a massive catastrophic public health crisis. I did not offer them sympathy. I offered them a highly functional, completely transparent lifeline. I slid a thick, legally binding memorandum of understanding across the cheap laminate table. It was a preliminary contract officially designating Blue Ledger Compliance as the absolute architectural authority for a brand new, impenetrable monitoring grid. The contract was entirely contingent upon the state officially stripping the corridor project away from Blackmere Utilities Group. The municipal directors read the terms, exchanged a desperate look, and signed it without a single second of hesitation. I walked out of the municipal building at midnight, the cold Ohio wind whipping fiercely through my coat. I was completely ready. I was not going to walk into that massive public hearing tomorrow morning as a grieving, terminated employee begging the state for corporate justice. I was walking in as the undisputed architect of their absolute destruction. I was walking in ready to end their version of the story and start building something better in its place. The massive double doors of the state legislative chamber swung open at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning. The room was a cavernous amphitheater of polished oak and blinding camera flashes. Delia Holloway walked down the center aisle wearing an immaculately tailored, icy white suit. She carried herself with the calm certainty of someone who still believed power could protect her from consequences. She sat at the defense table, her posture rigid, projecting an aura of complete control. Nathan testified first. He sat beneath the blazing lights of the witness stand, raising his right hand and swearing on a Bible. Then, he proceeded to spin a masterful, completely fabricated narrative. He swore under penalty of perjury that he was entirely ignorant of the fraudulent vendor changes. He blamed Grant Tully for going rogue to hit performance metrics. Then, the lead corporate defense attorney stepped forward to twist the knife. The lawyer smoothly explained to the oversight committee that I had intentionally built an overly personalized, fundamentally flawed digital architecture. They argued that my sudden, unfortunate departure on my wedding day had created a massive administrative bottleneck, confusing Piper Shaw and causing the system to mistakenly upload the wrong safety files. They painted the $2.3 billion fraud as a mere clerical error caused by my poor coding. Then, the chief state auditor called my name. I walked to the podium. The entire chamber fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The Blackmere executives watched me like hawks. Nathan gave me a microscopic, desperate nod, fully expecting me to honor the massive financial settlement they had offered me the night before. He thought I was going to look at the microphone, confirm the system malfunctioned, and walk away a multimillionaire. "Miss Reyes," the chief auditor began, peering down at me over his glasses. "Can you please clarify the structural integrity of the ClearChain platform during the transition of power?" I did not pull a prepared statement from my bag. Instead, I handed a heavy, sealed manila envelope to the bailiff, who passed it up to the committee. Inside was a certified, cryptographic flash drive. "The system did not malfunction," I stated clearly, my voice ringing out across the vast room, bouncing off the high ceiling. "The system worked exactly as I designed it to work. It caught a massive, coordinated theft of public funds." A sharp murmur rippled through the gallery. Delia stiffened in her chair. "What you are looking at is not the internal Blackmere database," I continued, speaking directly to the panel of stunned auditors. "That database was compromised the weekend of my wedding. What you hold in your hands is a read-only, cryptographic duplicate pulled directly from an independent data escrow server attached to the municipal bond covenant. Blackmere has zero access to this server. It is mathematically impossible to alter." I watched the color completely drain from Nathan's face. He suddenly looked like a man who realized he was standing on a trapdoor. "Those logs prove an exact, unbroken chain of events," I testified, my words striking like hammer blows in the quiet room. "You will clearly see Grant Tully uploading the fraudulent specifications for the downgraded filtration membranes, completely bypassing the engineering department. You will see Delia Holloway routing those approvals through an unauthorized secondary channel. And finally, you will see the system demanding a maximum security override to process the illegal change. I paused, locking eyes with the chief executive officer. An override that was executed using the personal, highly encrypted digital signature of Nathan Holloway. The gallery erupted into chaos. The judge slammed his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. Delia turned to her husband, her mask of icy control finally shattering into absolute panic. But I was not finished. The true kill shot was still resting in my folder. Furthermore, I raised my voice over the din, holding up a single printed document. The defense has claimed the chief executive officer was completely unaware of the legal risks. I am officially submitting an internal executive memorandum, dated exactly 3 days before I was terminated. This document explicitly proves Nathan Holloway was warned by the bond underwriters that changing the material suppliers would violate the core financial covenants. He actively ignored the warning, and he personally authorized his wife to bypass the safety protocols because he was absolutely terrified of missing the Friday disbursement deadline for the quarterly financial report. The silence that violently crashed down upon the room was absolute. It was the heavy, breathless quiet of a massive empire collapsing in real time. The state auditors stared at the documents, then slowly looked at the executives. In that single, frozen moment, the entire truth was violently laid bare for the public. I was not fired on my wedding day out of petty spite or sudden emotional malice. I was surgically removed. It was a cold, calculated tactical strike designed specifically to eliminate the only watchdog capable of detecting their massive fraud before the state released $85 million in frozen taxpayer funds. They fired me when I was wearing a white dress because they needed my hands tied while they robbed the city blind. The fallout was instantaneous and utterly devastating. The State Oversight Committee did not even wait for the afternoon recess. They formally suspended Blackmere Utilities Group from all public operations effective immediately. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the panicked board of directors held an emergency, unrecorded vote and permanently stripped Nathan of his title as Chief Executive Officer. The State Attorney General formally transferred Delia's files to the Criminal Division, launching a massive federal investigation into procurement fraud, wire fraud, and falsifying municipal documents. Grant Tully was served with a grand jury subpoena before he even left the parking lot. Piper Shaw, terrified of a lengthy federal prison sentence, immediately retained a private defense attorney and formally filed to become a cooperating state witness against her own aunt. The $2.3 billion Great Lakes Renewal Corridor contract was formally removed from Blackmere's control and placed into a temporary holding trust to be awarded to a brand new, independent consortium. As for me, I walked out of the legislative building and directly into the bright, crisp afternoon sun. I never returned a single phone call from the Blackmere legal team. I entirely rejected their $3 million settlement offer. Instead, later that week, I sat in the municipal offices and officially signed a massive exclusive contract. Blue Ledger Compliance was formally hired to rebuild the entire tracking architecture for the new project consortium, under strict, independent oversight. 6 months later, Luca and I stood on a grassy ridge overlooking the massive, sprawling concrete footprint of the primary water treatment plant. The massive steel cranes were moving again. The correct, high-grade filtration membranes were being carefully installed under the strict supervision of Tessa Bloom, who had been rapidly promoted to the lead municipal inspector. The air was cold, but the sun felt incredibly warm against my face. Luca wrapped his arm tightly around my waist, pulling me close against his side. I looked down at the massive, clean facility, and my mind drifted back to the dark vestibule of that stone church. I remembered the heavy vibration of my phone. I remembered reading the cold, cruel text message that was supposed to completely destroy my life. Consider it my gift to you. A soft, genuine laugh escaped my lips. I leaned my head against my husband's shoulder. Delia Holloway had been absolutely right, though not in the way she ever intended. It truly was a gift. It was not the gift of losing my career. It was the ultimate gift of clarity, of absolute freedom, and of unimaginable power. She handed me the exact circumstances that forced me to build something of my own, and then had to watch the consequences of her own decisions unfold. Thank you so much for listening to my story today, and I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the hype button so this story can reach even more people who need to hear it.